The morning mist clung to the dense Virginia undergrowth like the breath of ghosts, and perhaps it was. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Morrison of the 5th Corps pressed his palm against the rough bark of an oak tree, feeling the tremor that ran through the forest floor. Somewhere in the tangled maze of the wilderness, 160,000 men were about to collide in what would become one of the most brutal battles in American history. It was May 5th, 1864, and Lieutenant General Ulysses Grant had just taken command of all Union armies. Unlike his predecessors, Grant had no intention of retreating after engaging Robert Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The dense, second-growth forest of the wilderness stretched for miles, a nightmarish labyrinth of thorny underbrush, fallen logs, and twisted vines that would soon earn its name as the Green Hell. Morrison squinted through the early morning shadows, trying to make sense of the terrain that defied all conventional military wisdom. Here, in this suffocating wilderness, cavalry became useless, artillery nearly impossible to position, and infantry formations dissolved into confused clusters of men stumbling through nature's own obstacle course. The irony was not lost on him that this battle would strip away all pretense of civilized warfare, reducing the conflict to its most primal elements. According to historical accounts documented in Bruce Catton's A Stillness at Appomattox, the wilderness represented a tactical nightmare that would favor neither side's traditional advantages. The previous evening, Grant's massive army had crossed the Rapidan River at Germanna and Ely's fords, hoping to move quickly through the wilderness before Lee could respond. But Lee, the master tactician, had anticipated this move. From his headquarters at Orange Courthouse, the Confederate commander had already set his forces in motion. Major General Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps was moving down the Orange Turnpike, while Lieutenant General Ambrose Hill's 3rd Corps advanced along the Orange Plank Road. Lieutenant General James Longstreet's 1st Corps, still miles away, was racing to join the battle. Morrison watched as his regiment, part of Major General Gouverneur Warren's 5th Corps, prepared to advance westward along the Orange Turnpike. The men's faces were grim beneath their forage caps, many still bearing the psychological scars of previous encounters with Lee's army. They had witnessed the humiliation at Chancellorsville just over a year ago, fought in the same cursed forest where Fighting Joe Hooker had been outmaneuvered and defeated despite overwhelming numerical superiority, but this time felt different. Grant was not Hooker, nor was he Major General George McClellan or any of the other commanders who had faced Lee and retreated. There was something in Grant's steady demeanor, his willingness to accept terrible losses in pursuit of victory, that both inspired and terrified his subordinates. The forest around them seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Branches reached out like skeletal fingers, catching at uniforms and equipment. The canopy above was so thick that even at midday, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Visibility rarely extended beyond 50 yards, sometimes less than 20. This was not a place for grand military maneuvers or brilliant tactical displays. This was a place where wars went to die ugly deaths. As Morrison gave the signal for his men to advance, he could not have imagined that over the next 2 days, the wilderness would consume nearly 30,000 casualties. The very nature of warfare was about to change forever in this green hell, where brother would fight brother in conditions more suited to wild animals than civilized men. The first shots rang out around midday on May 5th. Echoing through the forest like thunder trapped in a bottle. Colonel Morrison felt the percussion in his chest as Warren's 5th Corps encountered Ewell's advancing Confederates along the Orange Turnpike. What began as skirmishing between advance guards quickly escalated into a full-scale battle as both sides fed more troops into the grinding collision. In the dense undergrowth, regiments became separated from their brigades. Companies lost contact with their regiments, and individual soldiers found themselves fighting desperate personal battles against enemies they could barely see. The crack of musket fire created a continuous roar, punctuated by the screams of wounded men calling for help that often never came. Morrison watched in horror as his carefully drilled formations disintegrated within minutes of contact. The 516th Pennsylvania Regiment, which had marched in perfect order just an hour before, was now scattered across a quarter-mile of impassable terrain. Men fired at muzzle flashes and shadows, never certain whether they were shooting at friend or foe. To the south, along the Orange Plank Road, Major General Winfield Hancock's 2nd Corps had encountered Hill's Confederate 3rd Corps in an equally chaotic engagement. Hancock, known throughout the Army as Hancock the Superb, found his legendary tactical skills nearly useless in terrain that reduced warfare to its most basic elements. His men advanced through the underbrush like hunters stalking dangerous game, except the game was shooting back with deadly accuracy. The Confederate forces, many of them veterans of previous wilderness fighting, seemed better adapted to this nightmarish environment. They moved through the dense vegetation with the fluid grace of predators, appearing suddenly to deliver devastating volleys before melting back into the forest. Their high-pitched rebel yell, echoing through the trees, added an otherworldly quality to the battle that would haunt Union survivors for decades. Historical records from the official records of the War of the Rebellion indicate that by mid-afternoon, both armies had committed over 80,000 men to battle in an area of less than 6 square miles. As the afternoon wore on, the battle took on an increasingly surreal quality. Units marched in circles, completely lost in the maze-like terrain. Officers shouted contradictory orders that were lost in the din of battle. Wounded men crawled through the underbrush, leaving trails of blood that attracted clouds of black flies. The forest floor, covered with years of accumulated leaves and debris, began to smoke from the thousands of muzzle flashes igniting the dry tinder. Morrison found himself separated from his regiment, leading a mixed group of soldiers from at least 4 different units. They had stumbled upon a small clearing where Confederate and Union forces had fought hand-to-hand combat just minutes earlier. Bodies lay intertwined in death, their blue and gray uniforms so covered with dirt and blood that it was difficult to distinguish friend from foe. The psychological impact of fighting in the wilderness was perhaps more devastating than the physical casualties. Men who had fought bravely in open fields at Gettysburg or Antietam found themselves paralyzed by claustrophobia and confusion. The forest seemed to swallow sound, creating pockets of eerie silence broken suddenly by explosions of violence. Soldiers reported feeling as though they were fighting in a nightmare from which they could not wake. By evening, neither side had achieved any decisive advantage. The Union forces had been stopped cold in their attempt to move quickly through the wilderness, while the Confederates had failed to drive them back across the Rapidan. Both armies settled into defensive positions among the trees and undergrowth, preparing for what everyone knew would be an even more horrific day of fighting. As darkness fell, the forest took on an even more sinister aspect. The cries of wounded men echoed through the trees, creating a symphony of human suffering that would continue throughout the night. Both sides sent out parties to collect their wounded, leading to several tense encounters in the darkness between men who were no longer certain which army they served. Dawn on May 6th brought no relief from the nightmare that had engulfed both armies. If anything, the second day of battle would prove even more horrific than the first, as the very forest itself became a weapon against the men fighting within its confines. Colonel Morrison had spent the night huddled in a hastily dug rifle pit, listening to the moans of wounded men scattered throughout the underbrush. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the sweet, sickening odor of blood and torn earth. As the first gray light filtered through the canopy, he could see Confederate positions less than 30 yards away, so close that he could hear enemy soldiers talking in low voices. The morning began with Hancock's renewed assault on Hill's positions along the Orange Plank Road. Morrison watched through the trees as thousands of Union soldiers emerged from their positions, like blue ghosts materializing from the forest floor. Their advance was initially successful, driving Hill's exhausted troops back nearly a mile and threatening to collapse the entire Confederate right flank, but Lee had not earned his reputation through timid tactics. Just as Hill's line began to crumble, the long-awaited arrival of Longstreet's First Corps turned the tide of battle. These were Lee's most reliable troops, veterans of countless battles who moved through the wilderness with the confidence born of hard experience. Longstreet's counterattack was devastating in its precision and violence. His men struck Hancock's exposed left flank with such force that entire Union regiments simply dissolved under the impact. Morrison watched in fascination and horror as the blue wave that had swept forward minutes earlier came rushing back in complete disorder, men stumbling over each other in their desperation to escape the Confederate onslaught. Contemporary accounts, including those preserved in the Library of Congress Civil War collection, describe the fighting on May 6th as surpassing even the brutality of the previous day. It was around 10 o'clock in the morning when the true horror began. A Confederate muzzle flash ignited a patch of dry leaves near Morrison's position, and within seconds, the fire began to spread through the accumulated debris on the forest floor. What started as a small flame quickly became a roaring inferno that consumed everything in its path. The fire spread with terrifying speed through the underbrush, driven by a light wind that carried sparks from tree to tree. The thick canopy, which had trapped the armies in twilight for 2 days, now trapped them in a furnace. Wounded men who could not move fast enough were consumed by the flames, their screams adding a new dimension of horror to an already nightmarish battle. Both armies found themselves fighting not only each other but the fire itself. Units that had been locked in mortal combat minutes earlier now worked together, desperately to rescue wounded comrades from the approaching flames. The artificial boundaries of blue and gray uniforms became meaningless in the face of this natural disaster. Morrison led his mixed group of soldiers in a frantic race to escape the fire, carrying wounded men on improvised stretchers made from muskets and blankets. The smoke was so thick that breathing became a conscious effort, and men collapsed from heat exhaustion even as they fled for their lives. The crackling of burning timber mixed with the continued sound of gunfire created an apocalyptic symphony that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The fire burned for hours, consuming not only the forest but also the bodies of men who had fallen in the fighting. Estimates would later suggest that nearly 200 wounded soldiers perished in the flames, unable to escape their forest prison. The psychological impact on both armies was profound. Many soldiers would later report that the Battle of the Wilderness was the moment they truly understood that this war had moved beyond any reasonable definition of civilized conflict. As evening approached, the fire finally began to subside, leaving behind a landscape that resembled nothing so much as the popular conception of hell itself. Charred tree stumps jutted from the smoking ground like monuments to human folly, while the sweet smell of burning wood could not quite mask the underlying odor of death. The afternoon of May 6th witnessed one of Lieutenant General James Longstreet's most brilliant tactical maneuvers, followed by a tragedy that would alter the course of the battle and perhaps the war itself. Morrison, still leading his makeshift unit through the smoke-filled forest, found himself an unwitting witness to events that would be debated by military historians for generations. After his successful morning counterattack had driven Hancock's Second Corps back in disarray, Longstreet was not content to simply hold his ground. The old warhorse, as Lee affectionately called him, recognized an opportunity to strike a decisive blow against the entire Union left flank. While Hill's battered Third Corps held the Orange Plank Road, Longstreet conceived a flanking movement that would take advantage of an unfinished railroad cut running roughly parallel to the main battle lines. Lieutenant Colonel William Oates of the 5th Alabama Regiment would later describe the maneuver as the most audacious tactical movement I witnessed in 4 years of war. Longstreet personally selected 4 brigades under Brigadier General William Mahon and Colonel George Anderson to execute the flanking attack, using the railroad cut as a concealed avenue of approach. Morrison first became aware of the Confederate movement when his men reported hearing the sound of marching feet somewhere to their left, though the dense smoke made visual confirmation impossible. The Union forces, still reeling from their morning repulse, had formed a defensive line along the Brock Road, but their left flank remained dangerously exposed. Military analysts, as documented in Douglas Southwell Freeman's comprehensive Lee's lieutenants, would later praise Longstreet's tactical conception, while lamenting the cruel fate that prevented its full execution. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mahon's flanking force struck Hancock's exposed left with devastating effect. The attack came from an unexpected direction, hitting the Union line at a 90-degree angle to the main battlefront. Morrison watched through the smoke as entire Union regiments, caught completely off guard, broke and fled in panic. The 2nd Corps, which had begun the day with such high hopes, was now facing complete collapse. The Confederate attack rolled up the Union flank with mechanical precision, capturing hundreds of prisoners and several artillery pieces. For a brief moment, it appeared that Lee's army might achieve the kind of devastating victory that had eluded them since Chancellorsville. Union soldiers streamed eastward toward the Brock Road, many throwing away their weapons in their haste to escape, but fate, which had smiled on Lee's army so often before, chose this moment to intervene cruelly. As Longstreet rode forward to capitalize on his success, leading a follow-up attack that might have shattered Hancock's entire corps, Confederate troops from Mahon's own brigade mistook their approaching commander and his staff for Union cavalry. In the smoke and confusion, the volley that rang out at 4:15 struck down several members of Longstreet's staff and severely wounded the general himself. A musket ball passed through Longstreet's throat and right shoulder, leaving him barely conscious and unable to speak. The sight of their beloved commander being carried from the field on a stretcher had an immediate and devastating impact on Confederate morale. Morrison watched the Confederate attack stall and then collapse as news of Longstreet's wounding spread through the ranks. What had been a coordinated assault just minutes earlier devolved into confused fighting as subordinate commanders struggled to maintain momentum without their leader's guiding hand. The golden opportunity to destroy a significant portion of Grant's army slipped away, like smoke through the trees. The irony was not lost on seasoned observers that Longstreet had been wounded by his own men in almost exactly the same location where Stonewall Jackson had suffered his mortal wound just over a year earlier at Chancellorsville. The wilderness seemed to consume Confederate generals with the same appetite it showed for common soldiers. Lee himself rode forward to take personal command of the stalled attack, his presence temporarily rallying the Confederate forces. But the crucial momentum had been lost, and Hancock's corps, though badly bloodied, managed to establish a defensive line along the Brock Road. The log breastworks that Union soldiers had hastily constructed became the anchor that prevented a complete rout. As darkness fell on May 6th, both armies once again settled into their positions among the charred remnants of the forest. The day's fighting had cost both sides dearly, but perhaps no single casualty would prove more significant than the loss of Longstreet, whose tactical genius had been Lee's most reliable weapon in the Eastern Theater. The dawn of May 7th brought an eerie quiet to the wilderness, broken only by the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle and the constant moaning of wounded men scattered throughout the forest. Colonel Morrison, his uniform torn and blackened with smoke, stood among the charred remains of what had once been a thriving woodland, contemplating the magnitude of the carnage that surrounded him. In 2 days of fighting, the Army of the Potomac had suffered approximately 17,500 casualties, while Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had lost roughly 11,000 men. For previous Union commanders, such losses would have been the signal for an immediate retreat across the Rapidan River, another failed campaign against the seemingly invincible Robert Lee. But Ulysses Grant was not like his predecessors. As Morrison would later learn, the general who had earned fame capturing Vicksburg was already planning his next move, and it would not involve retreat. The Army of the Potomac was about to discover what it meant to serve under a commander who understood that wars were won through relentless pressure, not elegant maneuvers. Throughout the morning, both armies remained in their positions, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Lee, weakened by the loss of Longstreet and aware that his smaller army could not sustain such casualties indefinitely, hoped that Grant would follow the pattern established by previous Union commanders and withdraw after the bloodletting in. The Wilderness. As documented in Grant's personal memoirs, published posthumously in 1885, the general later wrote that he never seriously considered retreat after the Wilderness fighting, viewing it merely as the opening phase of a larger campaign. The decisive moment came that evening as Grant's army began to move. Morrison, marching with the remnants of his regiment, initially assumed they were beginning another retreat. The column moved south along the Brock Road, the same route that previous defeated Union armies had taken in their flight from Lee's forces. But as the march continued, Morrison began to realize that something was different. Instead of turning east toward the river crossings that led back to safety, the army continued moving south. Word spread through the ranks like wildfire. Grant was not retreating. Despite the terrible losses in the Wilderness, despite facing the same Robert Lee who had humiliated every previous Union commander, Grant was advancing deeper into Virginia. The psychological impact on the Army of the Potomac was immediate and profound. These were men who had been conditioned to expect defeat when facing Lee, soldiers who had learned to measure success by how orderly their retreats could be conducted. Now, for the first time, they were advancing after a battle with Lee's army, continuing a campaign rather than ending it in failure. Morrison watched grown men weep with relief and renewed hope as they realized what Grant's decision meant. Captain James Wilson of the 20th Maine Infantry would later write to his wife, "For the first time since this war began, we have a general who fights instead of runs. Whatever else may happen, we are no longer retreating from Lee." The Confederate response was swift and predictable. Lee, recognizing that Grant's continued advance posed a mortal threat to his army and to Richmond beyond, began his own rapid movement south. The race for Spotsylvania Courthouse was about to begin, a contest that would determine whether Grant's strategy of relentless pressure could overcome Lee's tactical brilliance. As the two armies moved through the darkness, leaving behind the horror of the Wilderness, Morrison reflected on what the past 2 days had revealed about the nature of warfare itself. The traditional concepts of battlefield honor and military glory had been consumed in the fires that still smoldered among the trees. What remained was something far more primitive and terrible: the simple determination to destroy the enemy regardless of cost. The Battle of the Wilderness had indeed redefined the nature of the war, but not in ways that anyone had anticipated. It had stripped away the last vestiges of romantic notions about conflict, revealing war in its most elemental form. Both armies had been changed by their passage through that green hell, hardened into instruments of destruction that would make the coming battles even more terrible than what they had already endured. Grant's decision to continue south after the Wilderness would prove to be one of the most significant strategic choices of the entire war, setting in motion a campaign that would eventually lead to Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. 11 months later. As the armies departed the Wilderness in the early morning hours of May 8th, Colonel Morrison turned for one final look at the battlefield that had nearly consumed him. The rising sun cast long shadows through the skeletal remains of trees, creating a landscape that seemed more suited to Dante's vision of purgatory than to the Virginia countryside he had known before the battle. The full magnitude of what had transpired in those 2 hellish days was only beginning to become clear. Beyond the staggering casualty figures, nearly 30,000 men killed, wounded, or missing from both armies combined, the Battle of the Wilderness had fundamentally altered the character of the American Civil War. What had begun as a conflict between gentlemen had devolved into something approaching total war. Morrison's own regiment, which had entered the Wilderness with over 400 men, could now muster barely 150 effectives. The others were dead, wounded, or simply missing in the chaos of forest fighting. Similar scenes were repeated throughout both armies, with veteran regiments that had fought together for years reduced to mere shadows of their former strength. The wounded presented perhaps the most heartbreaking sight. Field hospitals, hastily established in clearings carved from the forest, overflowed with men whose injuries defied the primitive medical knowledge of 1864. Surgeons worked by candlelight, performing amputations without adequate anesthesia while the screams of patients echoed through the trees. Many wounded men, unable to be evacuated quickly enough, simply died where they lay among the charred undergrowth. Historical accounts, including those preserved in regimental histories housed at the National Archives, consistently describe the Wilderness as marking a turning point in soldiers' attitudes toward combat. The psychological casualties were perhaps even more extensive than the physical ones. Men who had entered the battle with romantic notions about military glory emerged as hollow-eyed veterans who understood that war was nothing more than organized butchery. The traditional military virtues of courage and honor seemed irrelevant in a place where visibility rarely extended beyond 20 yards, and death came from invisible enemies lurking in the underbrush. For the Confederate Army, the Battle of the Wilderness represented both a tactical success and a strategic disaster. Lee's forces had once again demonstrated their ability to hold their own against superior numbers, but the cost had been prohibitive. Unlike the Union, which could replace its losses from a seemingly inexhaustible supply of manpower, the Confederacy had no reserves to draw upon. Every veteran lost in the Wilderness was irreplaceable. The loss of Longstreet was particularly devastating to Confederate morale. The general's wounding by his own troops seemed to symbolize the self-destructive nature of the Confederate cause itself. His temporary replacement by Major General Richard Anderson, while competent, could not provide the same level of tactical expertise that had made Longstreet Lee's most trusted subordinate. For the Union Army, the Wilderness had provided a harsh but necessary education in the realities of fighting Lee's veterans. Previous Union commanders had often been paralyzed by Lee's reputation, allowing psychological factors to influence their tactical decisions. Grant's army had now faced Lee in battle, and while bloodied, had not been defeated. More importantly, they had not retreated. Morrison noticed a change in his men during the march south from the Wilderness. The easy camaraderie and youthful enthusiasm that had characterized the Army earlier in the war had been replaced by a grim professionalism. These were no longer boys playing at soldiers. They were hardened killers who understood that their survival depended on their ability to destroy the enemy before he destroyed them. The civilian population of Virginia also paid a price for the Wilderness fighting. The battle had consumed not only the forest itself, but also several farms and homesteads that lay in its path. Families who had lived in the area for generations found themselves homeless refugees, their property reduced to ashes and their livestock scattered or dead. The environmental damage was staggering and would persist for decades. The fires that had swept through the forest during the battle had destroyed an ecosystem that had taken centuries to develop. The Wilderness, which had been a dense woodland teeming with wildlife, was left as a blackened wasteland where nothing would grow for years. As both armies moved toward their next inevitable collision at Spotsylvania Courthouse, the lessons of the Wilderness weighed heavily on commanders and common soldiers alike. The battle had demonstrated that the war had entered a new phase, one in which traditional military conventions would give way to something far more brutal and unforgiving. 10 years after the guns fell silent in the wilderness, Colonel Morrison returned to walk the battleground where he had nearly lost his soul. The forest was beginning to reclaim its domain, young saplings pushing through the charred earth, but the scars remained visible to those who knew where to look. Rusted fragments of muskets and artillery shells still littered the ground, silent testimony to the horror that had unfolded among these trees. The Battle of the Wilderness had indeed redefined the nature of warfare, but its significance extended far beyond military tactics and casualty figures. It represented the moment when the American Civil War shed its last pretenses of being a gentlemanly conflict and revealed itself as the total war it had always threatened to become. Morrison paused at a small clearing where he remembered finding the bodies of Union and Confederate soldiers who had died locked in hand-to-hand combat, their weapons forgotten as they strangled each other with their bare hands. A simple wooden marker now stood there, erected by local citizens who sought to honor all the men who had died in the wilderness. Regardless of the color of their uniforms, the strategic consequences of the battle had reverberated throughout the remainder of the war. Grant's decision to continue south after absorbing such terrible losses had fundamentally altered Confederate calculations. For 3 years, Lee's army had succeeded by making the cost of victory too high for Union commanders to accept. Grant's willingness to pay that price, and to continue paying it through the subsequent battles at Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg, eventually forced Lee into the defensive positions that would lead to his surrender at Appomattox. Modern military historians, including those contributing to the authoritative Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series, have consistently identified the wilderness as the beginning of the end for Confederate hopes of independence. The human cost of this strategic shift was staggering. The overland campaign that began in the wilderness would ultimately cost the Union Army over 65,000 casualties in 6 weeks of fighting. The Army of Northern Virginia, unable to replace its losses, was slowly ground down through attrition until it could no longer function as an effective fighting force. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the wilderness lay in its impact on the men who survived it. Morrison had observed how the battle changed not just military tactics, but the very nature of American masculinity. The romantic ideals of honor and glory that had motivated so many volunteers in 1861 had been consumed in the fires of the wilderness, replaced by a grim pragmatism that would characterize American approaches to warfare for generations to come. The veterans who emerged from the wilderness carried with them understanding of war's true nature that would influence American society long after the last shot was fired. They had seen civilized men reduced to animals, had witnessed the failure of traditional military virtues in the face of industrial-scale killing, and had learned that victory belonged not to the brave or the righteous, but to those willing to accept the highest cost. Morrison's own post-war life had been shaped by his wilderness experience. Like many veterans, he found it difficult to readjust to civilian society after witnessing such extremes of human behavior. The nightmares never completely stopped, and certain sounds, the crack of burning wood, the rustle of wind through leaves, could still transport him back to that green hell where men had fought like demons among the trees. The battlefield itself gradually faded from public memory as the nation sought to heal the wounds of civil war. Unlike Gettysburg or Antietam, the wilderness offered no sweeping vistas or dramatic monuments to commemorate the fighting. The dense forest had swallowed the battle as it had swallowed the men who fought there, leaving behind only scattered artifacts and fading memories to those who understood its significance. The Battle of the Wilderness remained the pivotal moment when American warfare crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. It had demonstrated that democratic societies, when sufficiently motivated, could wage war with a ruthlessness that matched or exceeded that of any autocracy. The green hell of the wilderness had forged not just a new kind of American soldier, but a new kind of American nation, one capable of accepting terrible costs in pursuit of what it deemed necessary. As Morrison walked away from the battlefield for the final time, he reflected that the wilderness had taught both armies the most fundamental lesson of modern warfare, that victory belonged not to the side with the most courage or the best generals, but to the side with the strongest will to continue fighting. When all hope of glory had been consumed in the fires of total war,